thing I needed to do was 3D print my Colossus. This is a design by Print Minis. I got it through the tribes that they run on My Mini Factory. It's like a Patreon and you get something every month. They've done an amazing job designing this Colossus to be modular, and it all fits on my Elegoo Mars 3. Thank you, Elegoo, for sending me this. It's actually been a beautiful printer. It arrived working perfectly, not had any problems at all, and this time lapse is actually the previous one, because at the end of this time lapse it sat in the fluorescent light that I'd left on so I could take photos, and sadly it set the whole vat. So now you just get pretty pictures of it printed sat on the side. Once it's printed, the build starts much like any other 3D print. Quite a bit of sanding off the support nubs. Now, I maybe could have dialed my resin in perhaps a little bit better. Clear is renowned for blooming slightly, for being a little large, and I normally print minis, so this isn't set up to be dimensionally perfect. So I had a few little fitment errors which I needed to fettle before I could get on to the next stage. A quick word on handling resin. This has been cured, it's all been set up. It's safe to handle with bare hands, but the dust is not good for your health. It's not good to get in the lungs. So I'm wet sanding. I'm forever putting my files and sanding paper in water to make sure no dust is coming off. And then I rinse off the parts in a tub of water as I go along, or use a brush, as here. And once everything fitted, I was good to go. And then it was time to paint. But first, let's clean those parts up. There's still a bit of dust left on them. Little spot of fairy liquid, other products do exist, some water and an ultrasonic cleaner will do the job. Each batch got 4 minutes, and then I left them on a pile of paper towels to dry. The next morning I used double-sided sticky tape to stick them down to just bits of plain cardboard I've cut out of boxes. Then it was outside for a little bit of priming. This is Army Painter White Matte Primer, and I actually use it for the interior. I don't paint it again with anything else. With the primer on, it's easier to see any blemishes, and it's time to just sand those out again. A lot of filing and sanding of support areas more than anything else. And resin printers are not above throwing you a curveball like this line across the front. I ended up sanding it out to try and get rid of it. I didn't glue many parts at this stage, just for ease of painting, but one or two did get stuck and then filled and cleaned up. And then it was time to add the magnets. Now, most of this is held together with magnets, and they're 5 by 1mm magnets, but I didn't have many of those, so I got going with my 5 by 1.5, and these tops just needed a bit of clearing out. With this is a Despy electronic pen. I absolutely love it. It's brilliant for doing things like this. It took a while, but finally the top, which holds the container, sat flush on the base, which is the chassis of the vehicle, and I was able to just glue the magnets in place with some super glue, making sure they were all the same way round. And once I had that Despy electronic pen tool out, I used it everywhere to clean up any of the areas which just weren't flat enough. It's great for getting into small gaps and getting rid of the bumps that come along with basically supports, which are part of resin printing. Finally, time to paint. Now the colour scheme is going to be white, orange and black. So quite simple. I'm not really going to paint the inside. Just going to stay in the primer, so it has a slightly different texture to the gloss white outside. But first I needed to mount all of my pieces on these little clippy things. You can either buy the clips and bamboo sticks and these bases, or you can make your own. The metal ones I'm using are actually for placeholders, and the card is for some boxes that I just cut up and sellotape together. Not every piece is easy to clip though, and for some of them I use blue tack. As long as the piece isn't too big, it works okay. I did have a couple that fell off. For the areas staying white, I started off with a bit more primer just to make sure I had a good base for my white to go on. White isn't always the thickest, most covering colour. Certainly not when I thin it as much as I do. Just airbrushed it on. For the other areas though, that want to be black, I used a black primer. Now both these primers are Mr. Surfacer. It's a lacquer paint, it's sprayed through an airbrush. I have got full respirator, gloves, an airbrush booth and exterior fans, the works going. This stuff stinks. But because I was spraying this in one go, I actually sprayed all the white before I sprayed the black so that I wouldn't be trying to wash white paint through after black. And the paint is Mr. Colour, still a lacquer, super white gloss. For the black, I'm not a huge fan of using a really stark, dark black. So this is tyre black. It's really, really just off black grey. I don't think it really makes a lot of difference, but just plain black can look a little dark and suck all the light out of your photos at the end. And then as if by magic, the bulk of my painting was done. And at this point my 5x1 magnets arrived, so I was able to put together the container and the undercarriage, which all clunked together with magnets. I also had to do a little bit more sanding where the paint had built up and just destroyed the push fit. And once I'd done that, I numbered all my magnets so I'd get these things in the right order after I'd taken them apart, weathered them and put them back together several times. I'm hand painting on the orange stripe. It's just the easiest way with all the rivets and knobbles to go around. Masking it would be a nightmare. But I did put masking tape on more as a guide so I would know where to paint the orange. And because I wanted the edge to be slightly eroded and chipped, I didn't need it to be completely flush. So in some places I just hand painted along the line. In other places I painted over the masking tape and used it to create a sharp edge. Don't worry, it gets toned down a lot in the weathering stage. Once this was done, it was time to move on to the details. I only really painted in red and black at this point. I did do some silver occasionally as highlights on the interior, and we'll get to the weathering in a minute, which also uses quite a lot of silver. Now for the silver, I first of all tried Vallejo silver. It's okay, but going over white doesn't really show it off, and I wanted a bit more pizzazz. So I pulled out my Molotow chrome pen. This is amazing and gave a great result. But with that Molotow chrome pen out, I thought, I'm going to scratch up the outside. I'm going to put in loads of weathering and wear and tear. And actually I didn't do it on the container, I only did it on the vehicle to show that the two are not always joined together. And I have to admit, I probably went a bit overboard. I put silver on every exposed edge, every single area that it could be worn, I wore it. Now there's amazing detail in this sculpt, and I've got to say, resin printing brings it out like nothing else. And to show off that detail, I wanted to put a panel line on. Now a panel line is just a wash. I could have done an oil wash, but I've got these Tamiya enamel washes in a number of different colours. And the favourite colour is dark grey. It's not as stark as black, but it still shows up very, very dark. So I decided to panel line every rivet, every detail. There are a lot of rivets. I'm having riveting time, honest. And I hadn't even finished the first piece. Anyway, in the meanwhile, I got on with doing some of my figures. Now, there are two figures, a driver and a gunner. I decided to paint them very, very simply because they're inside. So I used these speed paints by Army Painter. I did a whole video on them. It's the first time I've ever used them in my life. And they're useful for things like this that are interior details. I basically just covered them in this ink-like, wash-like paint, one coat. I did green, and then I did a dark blue, and I was done on them. But it's all looking a bit disjointed, so time to tie it together with an oil wash. Now these are just three dusty colours that I had. Ibtalung 502 is the brand. And I put them on this piece of cardboard box 3 days earlier so the oil would come out, so they'll dry much more quickly. And then I thought, oh, I'll just knock over all my white spirit. Once I'd mopped all that up and sat there with the smell of white spirit for most of the rest of the day, I remembered I was supposed to use odourless thinners. This is just artist white spirit, but if you use odourless thinners, they don't smell as much. That doesn't mean they're any better for you, so just watch out. This stuff is fairly noxious. It does smell. There's a reason for that. It's a petrochemical. So you could wear a mask if it's irritating you. Time to get back to the weathering though. I use white spirit and create a wash. Now you can make it thicker or thinner depending where you are, which is why I don't mix a bulk amount and just splosh it on. I have a lot more control this way. And the idea is that you just cover everything with a small amount of dust. Two reasons for this. One, this oil coat is going to dry matte, so it will tone down all my gloss paint. Why did I paint it gloss if I was worried? Well, gloss helps the panel lines run properly. Let's just look at that for a sec. If we flash back a bit, this is the panel lining, it's just a wash. And you can see on the interior, it's spread through the whole of that matte primer surface. Now, it's not a particularly strong paint, but because it's got a matte surface, it wicks the panel liner around. Let's compare that to the front that's in a gloss. It doesn't move at all, it just stays where you put it, and it grabs onto the nearest crevice and will go along there through capillary action. But because there's no matte finish for it to wick around, it's a lot more precise, and even when you put it on a surface, it beads on it, it doesn't spread through it. It gives a very different effect, and far more suitable for the exterior of this vehicle. But now I need to get rid of the crazy gloss that's everywhere and all that very, very shiny metal edges. And an oil wash will dry matte, especially if you use odorless thinners or white spirit. It's great for going over, and the same solvent, white spirit, will lift off your enamel. So if you work an area too long and you've got a little splodge of enamel from your panel liners, you can clean it up at the same time. So I really like this step of panel liner to bring out the details, and then a wash to mattify it down and to tie everything together. And it makes a huge but subtle difference. Weathered on the left with the oil wash, just panel line on the right. You can see how much more subtle it looks and how it just looks slightly more worn and weathered. But enough about oil washes. I basically put an oil wash everywhere. Time for the base. And I need this to be quite simple because the beauty of this diorama is all in the Colossus. Now these are slate chippings from the garden centre. I bought a massive bag years ago and I sieve them out with garden sieves and bonsai sieves and tea strainers. I didn't actually need to bother with that. I could have used the original bag. And the disc is a 20cm plywood disc for, craft purposes. Plywood to stop it warping. I was really worried about the warping because I'm going to put a lot of this slate on and cover it in glue. So to make sure it didn't warp, I first sealed it with a mix of brown acrylic paint and matte Mod Podge, let that dry, and then loaded it up with all the different slates. Gluing huge chunks of rock onto a bit of wood means plenty of glue, so I started off with white glue spread across the base. But when you come to sprinkle rocks on, quite often they just fall off the edge. So to keep them in place, I put masking tape around it and propped it up on a couple of blocks because the masking tape stuck out beneath as much as it did above. And with the prep done, it was time to add the slate finally. I started with the bigger pieces and moved through each of the grades, didn't really use the fine dust. I tended to make it finer in the middle, didn't really show a lot, but it was like there was a path. But given how beat up my Colossus is, obviously this is quite heavy going terrain on it. And if you're worried that I haven't test fit the Colossus on to see if the wheels will sit on the ground, don't worry, I have a sneaky way to get around that in a minute. But now it's time to glue all that in place. So first up, isopropyl alcohol and water. This is 99% alcohol, about a third, the rest water. And why do I put it on? I'm always asked this. It's to cut the surface tension. It allows the glue to flow better. Now I was worried a lot about the amount of liquid that went on here. So at the end I did tip it so it could all run off. But actually this plywood base did not warp a jot, and I was really pleased about that because I have done bases in the past that have looked more like bananas at the end of my gluing than I would like. The glue itself is about 50-50 white glue, that's PVA glue, and water. It's just in one of those little twist top caps, and I dripped it on and made sure everything was covered. I'm actually surprised how well this glues, but some of the pieces around the edge, because I was worried the masking tape would just get soggy and fall off, I didn't glue as much, and I waited for this lot to dry and then came back and did those later with a little bit extra glue to make sure they stuck. And when I removed the masking tape, when it was all dry, some of them came off and I had to re-glue them again. And at last it was time to put it all together. Now, still a little bit of fettling where the paint had thickened up, just some of the areas that I hadn't push fit in too much. So 1 or 2 little areas to sand, arms to glue on, steering wheels to add, and it wasn't without problems. Now I add 20% tenacious to my mix to make it less brittle, but this bit still snapped off. To be honest, it's nothing that a bit of super glue can't fix. So I glued it back on, sanded it a bit more, and got on with putting it all together. Now the observant amongst you will have noticed I'm using the little packet on the right of the screen. It's black tack. Got it from the TV show. It's like blue tack on steroids. It's great for holding on the small push fit details that don't quite push fit anymore because I might have fettled them a bit too much. Not saying anything. And I use that quite a bit to hold on the roof and the top of the cab, and also wherever anything didn't quite stay stuck, and if I moved it around it would fall off. Perfect for that. I mentioned I hadn't even built the Colossus when I did the base, and it may not fit. Well, yep, surprise, it didn't. Not to worry. This slate is so easy. I've not painted it or anything, it's just gone straight on. It's so easy just to put more bits under until every wheel is touching the ground. Perfect and very simple. A few more drops of glue and my base was done. And here we are. Thank you so much for watching. You know the drill. Subscribe, hit the bell button so you know when a new video comes out. If you want to support me, consider being a patron or a YouTube member. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the video and see you next time.